But let's go to the program, to the last session on the program on the macroeconomic impact, with two papers on the two very dear aspects of the macroeconomy for us central bankers. It's going to be a first paper on monetary policy and the second one on inflation. So the first one is going to be presented by Luca. You have half an hour.
All right, so thanks a lot, first of all, to the organizers for putting the paper in the program. So this is joint work with Federica Romei. Right, so one interesting feature of the recovery from the COVID recession has been its unbalanced nature, right? So during the recovery, we've seen very strong demand for goods and relatively subdued demand for services, which makes sense, no? Because during a pandemic, of course, consuming services, going to a restaurant, going to a gym is risky. So it makes sense that consumers will try to switch away from services and toward goods. Just to show you a little bit of data to motivate these claims. So, up there you see the share of goods and services in consumption expenditure in the US, which are, of course, the mirror image of each other. And what you can see is that since the start of the pandemic, there's been a big rise in the share of expenditure on goods. And in the case of the US, this rise has been very persistent because you see the data go up to last summer. So we're talking about a couple of years of very high expenditure on goods relative to services. This is actually a global phenomenon. So if you go to other G7 countries, you see a similar pattern, as you see down there. Perhaps, here the change in expenditure pattern has been a little less persistent, but, similar picture as in the US. Now, what's interesting from the point of view of an international macroeconomist is that while goods are typically traded across country, many services are not. So one way to see this changing consumption pattern is really as a rise in expenditure on tradable goods relative to non-tradable one. So essentially this kind of response, consumer response to the pandemic, pushes us in a scenario in which there is a global scarcity of tradable good relative to demand. There is a very abundant demand for tradable good relative to what the economy used to produce. This is an interesting scenario, especially if you compare it to what we used to have before the pandemic, and I will tell you more about this later on. And it triggered us and me and Federica to think about it. And we thought that we would organize our thoughts around three questions. So first of all, what is the optimal monetary policy response to this change in consumer behavior? Second, what is the role played by capital flows in the adjustment? So does it matter that we live in a world with high financial integration? And third, do we need international monetary cooperation? So in such a scenario, is it a good idea to make central banks talk to each other and cooperate? Or should they act on their own? So to tackle this question, we use a multi-country Keynesian model with multiple sectors. So the model is multi-country in the sense that we look at a global economy composed of a continuum of small open economies, so many small countries. The multiple sector part is a bit pretentious because in reality, here we just have two sectors, one producing a tradable good and one producing a non-tradable one. So think about goods versus services. And the Keynesian part comes from the fact that, at least in the short run, nominal wages are rigid, meaning that monetary policy has real effects, and that unemployment might arise due to weak aggregate demand. So the model has this Keynesian feeling. And the exercise that we do is quite simple. So we look at the optimal monetary policy response to a global reallocation shock, which is just a change in expenditure pattern that I showed you before. So a rise in expenditure on tradable goods relative to non-tradable ones. Just to give you a bit of the preview of the result. So first of all, I will show you that this kind of shock can help to explain why the recovery from the pandemic has featured a global rise in inflation. Because essentially, what is going on, what is going to happen in the framework is that as households want to consume less services, less non-tradable goods, this will tend to generate unemployment in that sector. And one way for the central bank or the government to try to mitigate this rise in unemployment is to let inflation, especially inflation in the tradable sector, to increase. Because when that happens, you give more incentive for firms in the tradable sector to absorb labor. And so, the central bank faces a trade-off between containing unemployment by letting inflation rise somehow, but at the same time, since there are some costs from letting inflation rise, it will also have an eye on not making inflation rise too much. And how will central bank navigate this trade-off? So often it will be the case that after this kind of reallocation shock, we will see a stagflation. So we will see both a rise in inflation and a rise in unemployment. And actually, this insight is not totally new. It builds on the structuralist literature on inflation, which tell us that during times of reallocation, of sectoral reallocation, some inflation might be good because it might help to foster this reallocation process. However, this literature typically is focused on closed economies, while here we are really interested in the international dimension of the adjustment. And regarding to that, I will show you two results. So first, I will show you that capital flows matter big time, because in our economy, capital flows are really a channel through which inflation gets transmitted internationally. So what does it tell us? That when you have this global rise in demand for tradables, it's really hard to understand what's going on if you focus on a single country. You should look at the global economy on its own. And more specifically, what I will show you is that in this scenario, capital inflows or trade deficits are good in the sense that they will help a country to contain domestic inflation without having a big rise in unemployment. But at the same time, whenever a country runs a trade deficit, it will tend to export inflation abroad. There is this sort of negative externality. And one way to interpret this result is that if you think about it, the US, since the start of the pandemic, have been running sizable trade deficit. The model suggests that through that, the US exported inflation toward the rest of the world. And then I will tell you something about gains from international monetary cooperation. And here I will argue that there is a risk that national central banks engage in a sort of reverse currency wars. So I will show you that here each central bank has an incentive to try to tighten monetary policy so as to appreciate its exchange rate and run a trade deficit, because that's a good way to reduce domestic inflation. But if all the central banks in the world try to do so, the impact on exchange rates and trade deficit will wash out, and all that you will be left with is an excessively tight monetary policy. So excessively high unemployment compared to what it would be optimal from a global perspective. And toward the end of the talk, I will link a little bit this result with a debate that was going on in the 80s during the Volcker disinflation. Okay, since I don't have much time, let me jump straight into the model. So, well, there are a few equations, but let me try to give you the intuition. So as I said, we look at a world economy with many small countries, each of which is inhabited by a representative agent. And this agent gets utility from consuming a tradable good and a non-tradable one. So, I don't know, this is the tradable good and this is the non-tradable one. Now, let me just point this parameter out for a second. So this omega here captures the share of expenditure on tradable goods. So typically, we hold this share of expenditure constant. What we are going to do today is that we are going to consider what happens when there is a sudden large rise in the share of expenditure on tradable goods. That's going to be the shock that we're interested in. And then you see the second term in utility, instead it captures some cost from inflation. It's just a reduced form way to capture all the costs coming out of undesirable redistribution, psychological costs, the risk that the economy loses its nominal anchor. So it's just a reduced form way to capture the idea that deviating from the central bank inflation target is costly. To make things simple, we assume that there is no disutility from working, so that households just supply L-bar units of labor on the labor market. But due to the presence of wage rigidities that I will introduce later on, it might be the case that households might end up working less than their endowment of labor. There might be some involuntary unemployment. And then down there you have the budget constraints, so households spend in consumption, they invest in bonds, and the all important thing here is that we are assuming that households get all the income from their country, so they get the sum of domestic labor income and domestic profits. These are the optimality conditions. Let me go briefly through a couple of them. So up there you have the equation describing demand for the tradable good. There are two pieces which are totally standard. So the more households expect to consume tradable in the future, the more they want to consume today. Second, the higher the interest rate, the less households would want to consume. And here this interest rate up there is, you can think about it as a summary statistic for the global interest rate. The new piece is the presence of this omega here, which just tells you that when omega increases, holding everything else constant, household will want to consume more tradables. The second equation is not too important, it's just the OIP linking domestic interest rate with the global ones adjusted for the exchange rate or inflation. The third one is more important because it tells us what determines demand for domestic non-tradable goods. And here there are three effects that are going to play a role. So first of all, demand for non-tradables is decreasing in the relative price. So if non-tradables are more expensive, households will want to consume less of them. Second, demand for non-traded goods is increasing in consumption of tradables, because here households want to have a balanced consumption basket. So if for some reason they consume more tradables, they will also want to consume more non-tradables. And third, you can see that demand for non-tradables is negatively related to omega. So when omega increases, households want to consume less services, and so demand for non-traded goods goes down. And then the last equation is just the user definition of the CPI. Okay, nominal rigidities, here we go very simple. So we just assume that the nominal wage is fixed in the short run, which is period 1 in the model, and normalized to 1. This means that in the short run, involuntary unemployment is possible. So the economy, the labor market can be in two states essentially. Either the economy operates at full employment, so actual employment is equal to all bar, which would always be the case if wages were flexible. But since wages are rigid, we also can think of cases in which actual employment is lower than household labor supply. There is involuntary unemployment in the short run. And then wages become fully flexible in the long run, so from period 2 on, so the economy becomes neoclassical after the short run. Firms here, it's also quite simple. So in the short run, in period 1, production is carried out by competitive firms. There is a bit of an asymmetry between the two sectors. So in the non-tradable sector, the production function is just linear. You put 1 unit of labor, you get 1 unit of non-traded good, meaning that the price of this non-traded good is equal to the wage. And since the wage is sticky, the price of the non-traded good is also fully sticky. In the tradable sector, instead, there are diminishing returns from labor, which essentially just means that if you want to induce firms in the tradable sector to produce more, if you want to increase YT, you need to give them a higher price, given that the wage is fixed. So what do we want to capture with this? So as you might guess, we are going to look at a scenario in which we want to expand the production of tradable good. And this assumption just captures the idea that if you want to expand quickly production in a given sector, you're going to run into diminishing returns. Or another way to see that is that if you want to change the production mix between services and goods quickly in an economy, you're going to incur in productivity losses, which are captured in this very simple way. Notice also that up there, we are assuming for simplicity that there is perfect sectoral labor mobility, but this decrease in returns can also be one reduced form way of capturing mobility costs, the cost of shifting labor out of one sector into the other. All right, then the law of one price applies, meaning that once you adjust for the exchange rate, the price of the traded good has to be the same across the whole countries. This just means that whenever you will see an increase in the domestic price of tradable good, that corresponds to an exchange rate depreciation. So there is a mapping between these two prices. And then to make this simple, we just assume that in the long run, after period 2, there is just some constant endowments of the two goods. All right, we're almost there. So market clearing. So in every country, the trade balance, so the difference between production of tradable good and consumption, has to be equal to capital flows, right? If a country is running a trade balance deficit, it must import capital from abroad. In every country, production of non-traded goods has to be equal to output period by period, and then the labor market is such that labor demand by firms cannot exceed household labor supply. So we're going to be interested in deriving the optimal monetary policy. In the long run, the optimal monetary policy here is super simple, because in the long run, monetary policy has no real effects. There is an inflation cost, so the best that the central bank can do is just to keep inflation equal to target. In the short run, instead, things get a bit more interesting, because in the short run, monetary policy can affect output and employment. And here we're going to assume that each national central bank will set monetary policies so as to maximize domestic utility. So each central bank just cares about the utility of its domestic citizens. Okay, if you remember, 1 second ago I told you that the price of the non-traded good is fully sticky in the short run. The only price that can move is the price of the tradable good. So I will frame monetary policy directly in terms of a choice of this price. Bear in mind that whenever the central bank chooses to let this price increase, this is similar to a monetary policy expansion, essentially. And then the scenario that we look at is very simple. So we consider a global economy in which omega is equal to its steady state value at the start of period 0. Then in the short run, in period 1, there is a sudden rise in this preference for tradable good. And then from period 2 on, we go back to the initial steady state. And for most of the talk, I will consider a case in which countries are perfectly symmetric. All right, so as an intermediate step, let me show you what happens under financial autarky. So in this simple economy, essentially financial autarky corresponds to a case in which all the countries are close to each other. It's like a closed economy case. It's useful to build up intuition. So here, in this case, every central bank will choose monetary policy to maximize domestic utility, subject to the private sector behavior. So the first constraint just captured the idea that since firms in the tradable sector optimize, if you want to produce them more, you need to give them a higher price. The second constraint just captured the consumer's demand for the non-traded good, and then we have the labor market clearing condition. Now, one nice thing of this model is that if you aggregate these three equations that describes the private sector behavior, you get a Phillips curve. So you get a positive relationship between short-run inflation and short-run employment. However, this is not the Phillips curve that we usually have in mind, no? Because we usually think that higher employment leads to higher inflation because it leads to higher wages. This channel is shut off in this framework. So where is this Phillips curve coming from? Well, through three effects, essentially. So here, first of all, a rise in inflation, a rise in the price of the traded good tend to boost employment in the tradable sector, right? Because you give a higher price to these firms, firms want to employ more workers, and so you have some labor reallocation. Second, a rise in the price of the tradable good also trigger an expenditure switching effect. So when the price of tradable increases, domestic non-tradable goods become cheaper, so households want to consume more of them. So a rise in inflation also supports employment in the non-traded sector. And then you have a third effect, which you can think a bit like a Keynesian multiplier. So here, when you have a rise in the price of the tradable good, you have higher production of tradable. So consumers will get higher income from that sector, they will get wage and profit income from that sector, and they will want to spend that. And through this income effect, an increase in the price of the traded good also boosts employment in the non-tradable sector. So here, letting inflation rise in the traded sector increases employment everywhere in the economy. The other interesting thing is that if you look at the red term in the Phillips curve, you see that this preference shock, this omega, shifts the Phillips curve. So it acts like a cost price shock. In particular, if you have an increase in this omega, this worsens the trade-off between inflation and employment faced by the central bank. Well, why is that the case? Because when omega increases, households want to consume less services. So if inflation is unchanged, this is going to lead to unemployment. So through this channel, an increase in omega worsens the trade-off between inflation and employment. It acts like a negative cost price shock. And the optimal monetary policy, faced this negative cost price shock, will trade off the inflation cost against the employment benefits of letting inflation rise. Let me show you how this works graphically. So here you have inflation on the vertical axis, employment on the horizontal one. The red line down there is the Phillips curve, this upward slope relationship between inflation and employment. The blue line is the optimal monetary policy, which here it turns out to take a very simple form. So essentially what the central bank does is just to focus on maintaining the economy at full employment if inflation is low enough. But then, the optimal monetary policy also entails not letting inflation increase above the ceiling. Essentially, the optimal monetary policy here imposes a cap on inflation. Now, let's say that we start from the steady state here, in which the economy operates at full employment, and let's say that we have this reallocation shock, this reallocation of demand between the two sectors. What is going to happen? Well, the Phillips curve shifts toward the left, it worsens, and the optimal response of the central bank here is to let both inflation increase, but also employment fall. So this tells you that this kind of reallocation shock can generate a state of stagflation, a state in which you have both high inflation and high unemployment. Another way to see it is through this graph. Here I'm showing you what's the response of inflation and unemployment under the optimal monetary policy to larger and larger reallocation shock. And what this tells you is that if the reallocation shock is small, then it's optimal for the central bank to let inflation rise to maintain the economy at full employment. But once the shock gets large enough, then you see both inflation and unemployment increase. So we have global stagflation. Right, okay, so now let's turn to the more realistic case of free capital mobility. So what happens when countries can trade in financial assets among themselves? So it turns out that there are mainly three changes compared to the case of small economies. So the first is perhaps the most important. So in a world in which countries can run trade deficits and trade surpluses, there is no tight link between short-run consumption of the tradable good and short-run production at the country level. Meaning that if there is an increase in demand for tradables in a given country, consumer can satisfy that by importing more tradables from abroad rather than producing more of them. So now one channel through which, in principle, households can satisfy their higher demand for tradables is to run a trade deficit. The second important aspect is that here capital flows, trade balance, trade deficits, and trade surpluses affect the demand for non-tradable goods. So if you think about a country which starts running a trade deficit, this country will experience an increase in consumption of traded goods. And as you can see it from this expression, this will push up demand for domestic non-traded goods. So capital inflows tend to boost domestic demand for non-tradables and domestic employment. The third factor is that now in an open economy, in a financially open economy, monetary policy is less powerful, in the sense that for a given rise in inflation, the national central bank is going to get a smaller positive impact on domestic employment and domestic demand. Why is that the case? Well, because the income effect is weaker. Because it is still true that when inflation in the tradable sector increases, the country is going to expand its production of tradable goods. But now the Keynesian multiplier triggered by that is going to be smaller. Why? Because now households are going to save a good chunk of their increased income from the tradable sector in net foreign asset. Or to say it differently, they're going to sell a good chunk of the increase in production of tradable goods abroad. So through this effect, you have that in a financially open world, domestic monetary policy are less effective in the sense that for a same rise in inflation, they get a smaller impact on employment. Now, as an intermediate step, again, let me show you what happens when a single country is hit by a reallocation shock. So when the rise in omega occurs in a single country, say the US, for instance. Then it's easy to show that this country will react by running a trade deficit. So there is higher demand for tradable goods in a single country. Consumers in that country will want to borrow from the rest of the world and run a trade deficit to satisfy this higher demand. What's interesting is that this trade deficit and this capital flow will affect the Phillips curve. So you can see that in open economies, you have an additional term in the Phillips curve, which is the red term down there, which captures the impact of capital flows on the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And if you look at it, what this equation is telling you is that capital inflows, trade deficit, improve the domestic trade-off between inflation and employment. Why? Because when a country runs a trade deficit, this pushes up demand for domestic goods, meaning that for a given amount of inflation, you get higher employment. So essentially what this model is telling you is that in this situation in which there is very high demand for tradable goods, running a trade deficit is good from the point of view of macroeconomic adjustment. It allows you to have lower inflation and higher employment. Again, here, just to make this point graphically, I'm showing you what happens to inflation and unemployment under more and more severe reallocation shock. The blue line is financial autarky, what I showed you before. The red line is what happens under free capital mobility in the case of an idiosyncratic shock. And this tells you that running a trade deficit allows this country to have both lower inflation and lower unemployment. All right, all good. However, the interesting case for us is one of a global shock. So what happens if the rise in omega occurs in every country in the world, which is what happened pretty much during the pandemic. So in this case, every consumers around the whole world will try to borrow in the international credit markets to increase its consumption of tradable goods. But of course, in equilibrium, that's not possible. No? In equilibrium, trade has to be balanced. So what will happen is that the world interest rate will increase until trade balance is restored. So in the case of a global shock, of course, we cannot have an impact on actual trade deficits or exchange rates. This doesn't mean, however, that capital mobility, financial integration doesn't matter for the adjustment, because it is still true that having free capital mobility makes monetary policy less powerful. Monetary policy less powerful in stimulating domestic demand and employment. Meaning that compared to financial autarky, or compared to the case of closed economies, monetary authorities, national monetary authorities, will tolerate less inflation compared to the case of financial autarky. And again, just to show you this graphically, so say that, under closed economies, we were here. What is going to happen if we suddenly let country trade in financial assets among each other is that central banks will want to tolerate less inflation, and we will move to this equilibrium here. So compared to the case of closed economies, in a financially integrated world, in response to this shock, you get less inflation and higher unemployment. All right, so is this good or bad, right? Is this kind of response optimal, or do we need some form of international monetary policy cooperation? So to answer this question, you need to think about the problem of a global planner, a global central bank, which sets monetary policy around the whole world to maximize global welfare. And it turns out that in the case of a symmetric shock, the problem of the central bank is super simple. It just corresponds to the problem of national central banks in closed economy, because under a symmetric scenario, the world is just like a large closed economy, so it makes sense, no, that the optimal monetary policy under cooperation will correspond to the one under financial autarky. But this means that under free capital mobility, there is a deflationary bias. So national central banks under free capital mobility are implementing a policy which is too tight compared to the optimal. So why is that the case? Well, because there is an externality. Where is this externality coming from? So to think about it, suppose that a single country runs a monetary policy expansion, so it lets inflation increase, it depreciates its exchange rate. What is going to happen? So this exchange rate depreciation will boost production of tradable goods in that country. This will lead to a trade surplus, so to capital outflows toward the rest of the world. And as I argued before, the rest of the world who is receiving this capital will benefit. The rest of the world will be allowed to contain domestic inflation without having a rise in unemployment. So monetary policy expansion benefits the rest of the world. But the cost in terms of inflation of this monetary policy expansion are purely borne by domestic households. So the cost of this expansion is domestic, but the gains are partly international. And you see where this coordination problem is coming from. It's coming from the fact that national central banks do not have an incentive to internalize this positive spillover that a monetary policy expansion generates in the rest of the world. And in the last minute, let me tell you how this can lead to reverse currency wars. So imagine that we start from the global optimum. Imagine that we start from a case in which monetary policy is such that we are maximizing global welfare. And we say, okay, each country now can set monetary policy on its own. What is going to happen? Well, each country will have an incentive to tighten monetary policy, to increase the policy rate, in an attempt to appreciate the exchange rate and attract capital inflows. Because by doing so, it will reduce domestic inflation, which is good. But of course, if all the countries in the world do so, there will be no impact on the exchange rate and on actual capital flows. No, this monetary tightening will wash out in terms of capital flow and the exchange rate. The only thing that will happen is that we will end up with an interest rate hike which is too high from a global perspective, meaning that we will end up in a scenario in which unemployment is too high compared to what it would be globally optimal. So in a sense, the problem here is that national central banks really want to engage in competitive appreciation. So they want to appreciate their currency compared to their international partner. And I think that's interesting, because at least Federica and I were trained to think that the problem in international monetary cooperation was one of competitive depreciation. But that's a logic that applies when global demand is weak. While now we have the opposite. Now the scenario has changed compared to the pre-COVID period. Now the problem is that demand for tradable goods is too strong compared to supply. And here in this particular paper, this strong demand for tradable goods comes from a change in consumption pattern. But you can think about the hike in energy prices or global supply chain disruption as other channels that amplify the scarcity of tradable goods. And just to conclude, let me say that this might seem very theoretical, but actually if you go back to the 80s, to the Volcker disinflation, these concerns were there. So you see a big literature, a big policy debate about the fact that the US were disinflating at a time in which they were also running a very large trade deficit with a very appreciated dollar. And the rest of the world felt that by doing so, the US were exporting inflation abroad. And that eventually led to the Plaza Accord to bring the dollar down. So, there are some precedent of this idea that during times of disinflation, if you let national monetary authorities act on their own, you might have an excessively tight monetary policy due to this desire to run competitive appreciation. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. So the discussion is going to be done by Omar Rakedi from SAD.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank the organizers, Eva, Carlos, Juanfra, Olympia, Enrique. which, by the way, were all my former bosses. And since I'm here, I can do also some free advertisements. So this year, the bank has several positions on the market. So let your students know this is a cool place where to kick off a career. So it's a great pleasure to discuss this paper by Luca and Federica. So just let me give you like a brief summary of the paper. So the idea is like, let's try to back out what is the optimal monetary policy in a situation in which you have a sudden increase for tradable goods all around the globe, and therefore you have an exceptionally high imbalance of demand, which is asymmetric between tradables and non-tradables. And Luca and Federica, what they look is like they look at this question through the lens of a model with a continuum of small open economies in which households consume two types of goods, tradable and non-tradables. They dislike inflation. Nominal wage are fixed, and given the linear technology in the non-tradable sector, this means that also the non-tradable price is fixed in the short run, which you can think, I mean, in the model is just in the first period. However, in the tradable sector, the production is decreasing return to scale, which makes this price to be partially flexible in the short run. And then in the long run, which is like every period after the first one, then, as Luca said, the model becomes neoclassical, in which you have like a constant stream of tradable and non-tradable endowments. And then what they do is like look at the implication of a one-period shift in preferences towards tradables, which is like all of a sudden the amount of tradables that households want given like in their utility goes up just for one period. And then they look at, okay, how monetary policy changes depending on the degree of capital mobility. Okay, so the first part is like you can be thinking like it's a sequence of closed economies, and the second one is like proper small open economies. And here, what is like the first interesting takeaway is like this reallocation shock generates an increase in inflation and unemployment. Okay, so the inflation is concentrated in the tradable sector, whereas unemployment is concentrated in the non-tradable one. Okay, so as Luca said, this is an asymmetric demand shock that looks like a cost push shock. Okay? And I mean, this is already extremely interesting, because if you take any multi-sector model and if you consider constant return to scale technologies, CES preferences, and then you can put it sticky prices, input-output metrics, you name it. In that setting, sectoral demand shock has effects, differential effects across sectors, but does not alter at all aggregate quantities. Okay, so in other words, in standard multi-sector models, sector-specific demand shocks are irrelevant at the aggregate level. Okay? So here what breaks this irrelevance is the presence of rigid wages. And so what are then the implications of the model in terms of monetary policy? Like in closed economies, then the optimal monetary policy should be inflationary, because then what you get is like, of course, you cannot reduce the wage because it's fixed, and therefore you cannot reduce the price in the non-tradable sector. Then what you're can do is like to inflate the price in the tradable sector, and by doing that, you're gonna incentivize producers to produce more of that. Second is through this Keynesian amplification effect, with a larger income, you're gonna have like larger demand that also spills over to the non-tradable sector, and then you have a consumption expenditure switching effect, given like an increase in the price of tradable will help production in the non-tradable sector. But then things change when you introduce capital mobility, and it generates steeper Phillips curve at the country level, because again, as Luca said, basically the idea here is like, if you engineer an increase in income domestically, then what this guy's gonna do is gonna save part of it, okay? And therefore, rather than use of all of this additional income domestically, they're gonna use it to basically consume part of foreign goods, okay? Now, as long as this reallocation shock is idiosyncratic, so it just hits one of these small open economies, this is not such a big deal, because what households can do is like can borrow and through trade deficit can satiate their additional demand of tradable goods. However, things become tricky when everybody's wants tradable, and of course, in that case, you cannot borrow anymore, and then you have a situation in which everybody would like to borrow, so the interest rate goes higher, and this is where the main result of Luca and Federica pops up, which is like, in this case, a unilateral expansions, like in unilateral monetary policy expansions, what you're gonna do is like, it's gonna have positive effects on foreign countries, because it's going to allow foreign countries to somewhat reduce their imbalances in foreign demand, because basically domestically you can produce more tradable goods and sell it abroad. However, all the costs are borne domestically through higher inflation. Okay, so if you want to do this policy unilaterally, then you won't do it because basically you are bearing of the costs, and therefore, from the perspective of a global social planner, there's an externality in the sense that all the individual central banks are not internalizing the benefits of easing the imbalances in foreign demand. Okay, so this deflationary bias can be offset through international cooperation. Okay, so this is basically the main takeaways of the paper. So I really enjoyed reading a lot of the paper. So if you let me abusing the language and follow the jargon of the paper, I could say that already, although the unilateral work of Luca Federica is always highly interesting, their cooperation has a quality inflationary bias. And so what I like of this paper is like it mirrors the insight that they have in their AER paper, in which they look at this role of international cooperation in a case in which global demand is scarce and inflation is low. And here they show that you can have the same presence of an externality rather than going through motives of competitive appreciation to competitive depreciations when global demand is strong and you are basically in a situation of a stagflation. Okay. So what I'm going to be trying to do is like, I will try to connect the results to those of Guerrieri et al., which basically address a similar question in a closed economy setting. And I will try somewhat to think of what that could be the features that could be somewhat influencing some of the results of the model, and try to think, okay, how we can even extend potentially some of the insights. And then I will end up with a bunch of unfair comments, which is basically somewhat the way I'm thinking about this. Okay, now Luca gets into the board of the ECB. To what extent his voting behavior should be informed by the results of the paper? So the first thing is like, Luca already explained it, is like, what is interesting is like, in this setting, the Phillips curve is not the standard Phillips curve that we see in our model. So it's not like you have, by hitting the labor market, inflation goes higher, and therefore spills over to price inflation. In this case, the relationship between inflation and employment, the way it goes is through the linkages between the dynamics of the two sectors. And namely, the higher price and inflation in the tradable sector, what it does is it shifts demand to non-tradables and therefore reduces the involuntary unemployment in there. Okay, so, and again, these three mechanisms are higher prices boost the production of tradables, which through demand effects spill over non-tradables, and the consumption expenditure switching. Now, what happens with an asymmetric shock? This raises the demand of tradables. I mean, basically what has to happen is like relative prices have to adjust. So if prices are flexible, that's not a big deal. They will adjust, and then you're going to have either some inflation, some deflation, but then you're going to have the optimum. Now, if you have sticky prices, I mean, here the adjustment is costly, but still it's not a big deal, because, I mean, for instance, what the paper of Aoki shows is that, like, if you consider two sectors, one with sticky prices and one with flexible prices, then you can still engineer an optimal monetary policy which targets the price of the sticky sector, and still you can achieve the divine coincidence. Okay, so basically you can run an economy with basically zero inflation and zero unemployment. So here the problem again, it depends on the presence of, I mean, the case is full wage rigidity, but I mean downward wage rigidity, which would already make the trick, and generates a failure of the divine coincidence and this need of an inflationary bias for the monetary authority, because this divine coincidence failure make this asymmetric demand shock to look like a cost push shock. Now, like Guerrieri and co-authors address the same question in a closed setting, and basically what they're thinking is, okay, how can monetary policy influence the reallocation between like a booming and a stagnant sector, okay? And to what extent monetary policy should come and enhance this reallocation, to what extent instead should not be doing anything, okay? And what the results are arguing is like the optimal monetary policy stance depends crucially on the degree of labor mobility and the source of nominal rigidity. What I mean is the following. So if you consider a case that somewhat speaks to the one of Luca Federica, even though there are some differences, so if you take fully rigid wages and flexible prices, basically what they show is like the presence of a contractionary bias. Okay, so the idea here is that you need to think about a setting in which you have some costs of moving from one sector to the other for workers. Okay, so if the monetary policy generates inflation, basically what it does is it's somewhat helping the demand for the, in this case, the non-tradable sector. So what workers will do is like, since now you have more opportunity in the non-tradable sector, then they decide not to shift as they should to the tradable sector. And why this is happening? Because this costly labor mobility generates a congestion externality. So workers do not internalize that if they were to move to the booming sector, they will improve the job outcome opportunity of all other workers. Okay? And therefore, rather than generating inflation, what the central bank should be doing here is like just like make them suffer, and through that you're gonna stimulate the reallocation from non-tradable to tradable. However, if you instead consider a setting with downward wage rigidity and sticky prices, then they show the existence of an expansionary bias. Okay, so why now the result changes? Because in these cases, since wages cannot go down but can go up, the reallocation of workers from one sector to the other increases the wage in the tradable sector, and through this mechanism, then convinces workers to move and reallocate. Okay, so this is like these endogenous changes in wages, which is very relevant, and therefore in this case, what the central bank can do is like engineer inflation in the tradable sector, and which will come with an increase in wages in that sector, and that will generate the required amount of reallocation. Now, why I'm saying all these things? Because somewhat in this paper, the presence of perfectly mobile labor shuts down this mechanism. Now, Luca was saying, and this is true, so the presence of decreasing return to scale in the tradable sector somewhat can capture some mobility costs, but it captured through somewhat changes in profits rather than changes in wages. And here, the role played by this congestion externality in the way in which monetary policy affects allocation, I mean, crucially depends on how wages changes across sectors. So what I'm thinking is like, I mean, I'm wondering to what extent in this setting the optimal monetary policy would change by somewhat altering both the source of nominal rigidity and by allowing for costly labor mobility. Okay, and why this is interesting? I mean, first of all, it would be like a natural extension of Guerrieri et al. To the case of open economy. Second, we'll have like the spirit of Harry Verning or looking at monetary policy with the presence in a conjunction externality in the model of monetary union. And then what I think is like rather, I mean, this extension will not alter the main finding of the paper, but potentially will even generate the existence of the role of international cooperation in the case of even this contractionary bias case. And since I have 1 minute, then, I mean, this is more like shows that I had some free time than other things. But basically, I mean, what I wanted to say here is like, if I'm trying to take in Michael and Koto's data on price frequencies, and I've tried to define in my own way what is a tradable, non-tradable sector, I mean, I couldn't find large differences in price duration. And so and this is somewhat made me think that it could be a way, like, I mean, it's suggesting that maybe even trying to generalize the kind of nominal rigidity could be a useful way to go for. And then let me go into this bunch of unfair questions. So the question here is like, okay, how quantitatively relevant is this role of policy cooperation? Now, by quantitatively, I don't mean, okay, show me how results change if the two sectors are complementary or substitutes. Here, I mean, the two main things I'm thinking about is like, first of all, is how I can think of this question when there are supply chain disruptions. That is, even if you manage to convince workers to move from one sector to the other, still you won't be able to match this excessive demand, because there's something that doesn't allow to bring tradable goods around. And I think that what Luca and Federica are doing now is also to potentially incorporate supply shocks. And finally is, rather than considering like this continuum of small open economies, like think in a setting in which what you have is a combination of a fringe of small open economies and few price maker players like the Fed and the ECB. And so what this could be generating is not only a role for cooperation, but also something that becomes more like a strategic interaction in the spirit of Fari and Maggiori, in which then these dominant price makers, what can also do is somewhat decide through the way in which they can manipulate the word interest rate. And that was it.
Thank you, Mar. Let's gather questions. Juanfran first.
Very neat macro model and excellent presentation. Excellent discussion too, by the way. So I have no questions about the model, which is very, very, very elegant and very didactic. Let me challenge you on the application of the model to the current situation and the coordination between the Fed and the ECB. Because what we have is not only this global reallocation shock, but also supply shock, you know, the energy prices and so on. And the combination of both are apparently different in the US and the ECB, right? In the US, it seems that demand is more important and the reallocation shock is quantitatively more important than the supply shock, while in the Eurozone is the reverse, right? So my question is, how the gains for cooperation will change in this scenario? How your model can inform us about the gains from cooperation when the two shocks are not symmetric, but they are asymmetric. And then what is the nature of that cooperation, how that cooperation should be implemented?
Any more questions? Paul?
That was a very cool paper, great discussion. In the spirit of the discussant's comments about robustness of the results, one thing that came to mind is investment. Right, your model doesn't have investment. We know that the cyclical properties of the trade balance change quite dramatically once you start adding investments to this type of models. Have you thought about what that would do here?
More? No? Yeah.
Quick question. Is the solution here monetary policy, or should we have here fiscal policy? It's about changes in relative prices. So I mean, the monetary policy is not going to be very good in general in here. So maybe fiscal policy would be perhaps something worth trying. Thanks. And yes, great presentation and discussion, of course.
Thanks for the presentation and for the discussion. I have one question. Have you thought about the possibility of tradable goods being inelastic to prices, or the supply of tradable goods being fixed? And secondly, when you have, instead of this continuum of countries, two countries or many continuum countries, but one is the one that is providing the tradables, which is the US. Okay, so one of the countries is the only one which can provide the tradables, and that is what could change the results in the optimal policy. So both things are what we have now. Or what I'm saying is, Paul Volcker would not have done what he did in terms of results without having more oil coming from the North Sea. If there were not oil coming from the North Sea, he should have even moved up interest rate further to get inflation where he wanted to have. This is my reflection on your paper, if it can be taking into account these issues, how it changed. Your conclusions.
Okay.
Okay, so first of all, thanks a lot, Omar, for the great discussion, a very kind discussion. And what can I say? I agree with all your points. I think you raised very interesting comments. The one about labor mobility is definitely spot on. So we should think about it more. And I like a lot the comment about thinking of asymmetries in terms of size. Thinking about what happens if there is one or two countries which are leaders because they are big and so they have a bigger impact on the economy, and some other which are followers. And we need to think about it. It's not obvious to me, because you have different incentives. That's definitely an interesting aspect that we should explore. And this brings me to what Francisco comments, because yeah, you're right. So now the scenario is highly asymmetric. We have relatively strong demand in the US. We have very large energy shock in the euro area. And that you can also see it if you look at the trade balance. So in the first phase of the pandemic, it was the US who was running a big trade balance deficit, while now the euro area is seeing a progressive worsening. And on this I can say that to a first order approximation, if you think of high energy prices, supply chain disruption, negatively affecting productivity in the tradable sector, roughly speaking, the results are very similar to the one that I showed you. So the optimal monetary policy response looks quite similar. And we haven't worked out the case of optimal monetary policy under cooperation when we have asymmetric shock, but that's feasible. We should do it. I mean, one thing about this framework is that there is only so much that you can fit in a paper. No? We cannot address many of the points that you raised, but it's a simple framework. So if you think about an extension that you find interesting, I think it's easy to work it out. About investment, so okay, so we started this paper 1.5 years ago, and back then we thought that the demand pattern would normalize very quickly. And so we had in mind, a world in which firms didn't have time to invest. If you want, the gist of the paper is really what happens when you have a sudden change in the demand pattern. Firms do not have the time to invest, to change their productive capacity, and so you end up in a world in which productivity is lower, because now you have some firms that need to provide more goods, some others that need to provide less, and that's going to reduce productivity. Then it turned out that the shock is more persistent than what we had anticipated, at least in the US, and so probably firms are adapting to it with investment, and we could definitely, try to think about what happens in this case. I mean, here the obvious insight is that firms in the tradable sector will have an incentive to build up their productive capacity to satisfy this higher demand, and this should reduce inflationary pressures in the medium run. Again, it would be interesting to work out the implication for monetary policy cooperation. My guess is that in this case, tightening is even more costly because it hinders investment and the future adjustment, but it's just a guess. About fiscal policy, so this is something that we wanted to include at the start, but again, there is so much that you can fit in the paper. What I can say is that, the general insight that you get is that here national governments are going to do too little of all the policy that boosts the supply of tradable goods. So if you think of fiscal interventions, subsidies, or perhaps a removal of trade tariffs that increase the incentive to produce tradable good, what this model is telling you is that in general, national governments will do too little compared to the global optimum. Because here the problem is that you have this global scarcity of tradable good, and when a country does something to alleviate this scarcity, it benefits the rest of the world too, meaning that self-interested governments will do too little of it.
Can I reply quickly? But you could subsidize one sector, tax the other one, so that the price level stays the same if the concern is inflation, for example.
Yeah, I mean, that brings to the question of how feasible that is. But yeah, you could think about it. And then about the inelastic production of tradable goods, that's an essential part of the model. So precisely, we want to think about a case in which production of tradable is relatively inelastic. So if production of tradables was fully elastic, if production function was linear, there would be no problem. The adjustment would happen without a change in relative prices. And so this problem really bites when you have some inelastic supply, when the supply cannot adjust, at least in the short run. And that's where you need some inflation to help to mitigate the rise in unemployment. So that's really a key part of our story.
Okay.